The dinner party in our Chicago penthouse was flawless. Crystal clinking, jazz humming low, and Elena's hand resting possessively on my shoulder. But when her phone buzzed on the marble counter, she didn't just silence it. She turned it face down with a speed that betrayed a decade of trust in a single second. I smiled at our guests, pouring the Pinot Noir, knowing exactly who was on the other end because the high-fidelity microphone I'd stitched into the lining of her purse had already told me everything 3 hours ago. If the quiet unraveling of a perfect life keeps you up at night, stay close. There are tapes yet to be played, and if you want to witness the moment the silence becomes deafening, don't look away. The rain in Chicago didn't wash things clean. It just made the city slick and hard to hold on to. Julian Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of their 42nd floor apartment, watching the headlights on Lakeshore Drive bleed into long red ribbons. He held a tumbler of whiskey, neat, but he wasn't drinking it. He was listening. The apartment was a masterpiece of modern design, Italian leather, brushed steel, and acoustic perfection. As an engineer who designed concert halls for the Philharmonic, Julian had ensured their home was a sanctuary of silence. The triple-paned glass blocked out the wind, the sirens, and the chaos of the world below. But it also amplified the sounds inside. The front door clicked open, the heavy, distinct thud of the lock turning. Julian didn't turn around. He checked his watch. 9:43 p.m. "I'm sorry, Jules." Elena's voice floated down the hallway, preceded by the click-clack of her Louboutins on the hardwood. "The client dinner ran over. You know how Stefan gets when he starts talking about fabric sourcing." Julian took a sip of the whiskey. It burned, grounding him. "Stefan is in Milan," he said, his voice even, devoid of accusation. "I saw his Instagram post this morning." The footsteps stopped. Just for a heartbeat. A microsecond of recalibration. If you weren't listening for it, you would have missed it. But Julian heard the hesitation, the friction of her soul pivoting slightly on the floorboards as she shifted her weight. "Oh, right," Elena laughed, a breathless, airy sound that usually charmed boardrooms. She walked into the living room, tossing her Hermes bag onto the sofa. She looked radiant, despite the hour. Her hair was perfectly tousled, her lipstick slightly worn but still precise. It wasn't Stefan. It was his VP, the new guy. Marcus. I always get them confused. She came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. She smelled of rain, expensive perfume, and something else. A faint, woody scent of tobacco. Elena didn't smoke. "You've been standing here in the dark?" she whispered, resting her chin on his shoulder. "Just thinking," Julian said. He didn't lean into her touch, nor did he pull away. He remained a statue. "About what?" "Acoustics," he lied smoothly. "There's a dead spot in the Davies Symphony Hall design. I can't seem to fix the reverb decay." Elena sighed, tightening her grip before letting go. "You work too hard. Come to bed. I'm exhausted." She walked toward the master bedroom, unzipping her dress as she went. Julian waited until the bedroom door clicked shut. He set his glass down on the coaster with a deliberate, soft tap. He walked over to the sofa where she had thrown her bag. It was open. Inside, her phone screen lit up with a notification, a text message preview that vanished before he could read it. But it wasn't the phone he was interested in. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a device no larger than a button. It was a high-gain, omnidirectional microphone with a battery life of 72 hours. He had stolen it from his firm's prototype lab 3 days ago. He looked at the open purse. He looked at the hallway leading to their bedroom, where his wife was currently washing off the day. and perhaps the scent of another man. The dilemma wasn't whether she was lying. He knew the frequency of her deception. He had analyzed it like a faulty audio track. The dilemma was how much resolution he wanted. Did he want the low-quality hum of suspicion or the high-definition clarity of pain? Julian slipped the device into the inner lining of her bag, pushing it deep into the seam where it wouldn't be felt. "Coming, Jules?" Elena called out from the bedroom, her voice muffled by the walls. "In a minute," Julian replied. He pulled out his phone and opened an app. A flat green line appeared on the screen. He tapped the leather of her purse lightly. The green line spiked into a sharp red wave. Recording started. Julian turned off the living room lights, plunging the room into darkness, save for the blinking red LED on his phone screen. He wasn't just an engineer anymore. He was an audience of one, waiting for the performance to begin. The underground garage of the Meridian Tower was a concrete sarcophagus, chilled and silent, smelling faintly of rubber and exhaust. At 3:14 a.m., the motion sensor lights flickered on in sequence, tracking Julian's path like spotlights on a prison break. He wore latex gloves, not for drama, but because fingerprints were oils, and oils left smudges on the piano-black trim of Elena's Range Rover. Julian stood before the white SUV, the spare key heavy in his pajama pocket. Upstairs, 40 floors above, Elena was asleep. He had listened to her breathing for 20 minutes. A rhythmic, deep cadence that used to comfort him, but now only signaled opportunity. He pressed the unlock button. The car chirped, a sharp electronic sound that echoed too loudly against the low ceiling. He winced, waiting for a security guard or a sleepless neighbor to emerge from the shadows. Nothing but the hum of the ventilation system. He opened the passenger door and slid inside. The interior smelled different than the apartment. It was a capsule of her private life. There was a lingering scent of her vanilla latte, a discarded protein bar wrapper in the cup holder, and that faint, woody trace of tobacco again. It was stronger here, woven into the fabric of the headliner. Julian didn't look through the glove box. He wasn't looking for receipts. Paper could be explained away. He was looking for the truth that only audio could provide. He carried a small toolkit and a modified spectral recorder, stripped of its casing to fit into tight spaces. This wasn't the battery-operated button he'd dropped in her purse. This was a long-term solution. He lowered his head into the footwell of the passenger side, popping the plastic panel that covered the cabin air filter and wiring harness. His movements were precise, surgical. He identified the 12-volt constant power line, yellow with a thin black stripe. Snip. He stripped the wire. His hands didn't shake. That terrified him more than the act itself. He was splicing into his marriage, parasitizing the vehicle that carried his wife to work, to gym appointments, and to wherever else she went when the GPS was conveniently turned off. He wired the recorder directly into the car's power supply. It would never run out of battery. It would wake up the moment the engine turned over or a door opened. It would upload encrypted files to a cloud server he had rented under a pseudonym. As he taped the bundle of wires back together, wrapping them in noise-dampening felt to prevent any rattling, he felt a wave of nausea. This was the car they had driven to the Hamptons last summer. This was the seat where she had cried when her mother got sick. Now it was just a collection of frequencies and potential evidence. He snapped the plastic panel back into place. It clicked, a solid, final sound. Julian sat up and checked his work. Invisible. He pulled out his phone to run a diagnostic. The app confirmed a strong signal. The microphone sensitivity was high enough to pick up a whisper in the back seat, or a phone conversation on Bluetooth. He stepped out of the car, wiping the leather seat where he had sat, erasing his presence. When he locked the vehicle, the mirrors folded in like a closing argument. The elevator ride back up to the penthouse felt interminably long. When he slipped back into the master bedroom, the air was warm and smelled of lavender laundry detergent. Elena shifted in her sleep, her arm stretching out across his side of the bed, searching for him in the dark. Julian froze. He looked at her hand, the delicate fingers, the platinum band catching a sliver of moonlight. He wanted to reach out and hold it. He wanted to wake her up and confess, to beg her to tell him he was crazy. Instead, he slid into bed, keeping his back to her, and closed his eyes. But he didn't sleep. He lay there, waiting for the sun to rise, waiting for her to wake up and drive away so the recording could begin. The studio was a vacuum, soundproofed with high-density foam and suspended floors. It was the only place in Chicago where absolute silence existed. Julian sat at his mixing console, the glow of the monitors illuminating his face in a harsh, blue light. The file name was innocuous. Reseal 22-23-10-12-1730, WAV. It had been uploaded automatically from the Range Rover 3 hours ago. Julian wore his reference headphones, Sennheisers that cost more than most people's first cars. They didn't color the sound. They revealed it. Every breath, every shift of fabric, every swallowing of saliva was magnified. He pressed the spacebar, static, the low rumble of the engine, the rhythmic thump of tires on pavement. Then, the chime of the car's Bluetooth connecting, a phone dialing. "Hey!" Elena's voice cut through the mix. It wasn't her business voice, sharp and projected. It was softer, lower, a pitch she used to reserve for him in the dark. "Hey yourself," a man's voice replied, deep, textured, with a slight gravel. "Young. I didn't think you'd call until you were clear of the city." Julian's hand hovered over the volume knob, trembling slightly. He turned it up. He wanted to hear the grain in the man's throat. "I couldn't wait," Elena said. There was a smile in her voice. Julian could hear the moisture in her mouth as she spoke. "I felt like I was suffocating in that meeting. I needed to hear you." Julian closed his eyes. The words hit him harder than a physical blow. "I needed to hear you." She hadn't said that to him in 5 years. "How was he?" the man asked. "Julian." Elena sighed. The sound was a gust of wind in Julian's ears. "He's fine. He's distant. He's always listening to something that isn't there. I feel like I'm living with a ghost who pays the mortgage." Julian stared at the waveform on the screen. The green peaks and valleys represented his marriage disintegrating. He zoomed in on the track, isolating the man's voice. "You're not a ghost to me, Elle," the man said. Elle, a nickname Julian never used. "You're the most vivid thing in my life. The gallery is empty without you standing in the center of it." "Caleb, stop!" she laughed, a sound of genuine, unburdened joy. "You're going to make me crash." "Caleb." Julian typed the name into a notepad window on his second monitor. The cursor blinked, a rhythmic pulse of accusation. The conversation drifted. They didn't talk about sex. They didn't plan a hotel rendezvous. It was worse. They talked about art. Caleb described the light hitting a canvas he was working on, and Elena listened with a rapt attention that Julian could feel through the silence on her end. They spoke about their fears of irrelevance, their childhoods, their favorite times of day. It was an emotional affair, meticulously archived in high fidelity. Julian watched the timer on the track. 14:32. "I have to go," Elena said, as the background noise of the car changed, indicating she was exiting the highway. "I have to be home before he starts wondering why traffic was bad." "I hate this part," Caleb said. "I know," she whispered. "I love you." Julian froze. The waveform spiked red on the screen. "I love you." It wasn't a casual sign-off. It was heavy, weighted with intent. "Love you too," Caleb replied. The line clicked dead. The recording returned to the hum of the engine and the radio playing a meaningless pop song. Julian ripped the headphones off his head and threw them onto the desk. The silence of the room rushed back in, deafening and oppressive. He felt like he couldn't breathe, as if the oxygen in the room had been sucked out by the truth. He looked at the screen. There were 12 more files in the folder. 12 more hours of this. He picked up the headphones. His hands were steady now, calmed by a cold, terrifying resolve. He placed them back over his ears. He wasn't just a husband anymore. He was an editor, and he had a lot of material to go through. The gallery in the West Loop was a cavern of exposed brick and blinding white lights. It smelled of cheap champagne and expensive desperation. Julian stood near a structural pillar, holding a flute of sparkling wine that had gone warm 10 minutes ago. He wore his bespoke charcoal suit, the one Elena said made his shoulders look broad, the one she had straightened the lapels of before they left the apartment. "You look tense, darling," she had said in the elevator. "Just a headache," he had lied. Now he watched her. She was across the room, radiant in a silk slip dress that shimmered like liquid mercury. She was laughing, head thrown back, neck exposed, at something the man next to her had said. The man was Caleb. Julian recognized the voice instantly. It was the same timbre, the same gravelly texture he had spent the last 48 hours dissecting in his studio. But seeing him in the flesh was a different kind of violence. Caleb was younger than Julian, perhaps 28. He wore a paint-splattered blazer over a t-shirt, his hair purposefully messy. He looked like every cliché of a tortured artist, yet he possessed a raw, kinetic energy that Julian's precise, engineered life lacked. Julian watched Caleb's hand. It rested on the small of Elena's back, just for a second, before sliding away as a photographer approached. It was a practiced motion, a secret language of touch. Julian adjusted his cufflink. Inside his jacket pocket, his phone was recording, not a phone call, but the room. He was capturing the ambient noise, the laughter, the deceit. "Julian, so glad you could make it." Julian turned. Caleb was walking toward him, hand extended, a confident, lopsided grin on his face. Elena trailed a step behind him, her eyes scanning Julian's face for any sign of a crack. "Caleb," Julian said. He took the younger man's hand. It was warm, calloused from brushes or sculpting tools. Julian squeezed it, just a fraction harder than necessary. "Excellent turnout. Elena has done wonders with your PR." "She's a miracle worker," Caleb said, his eyes flicking to Elena with a warmth that made Julian's stomach turn. "I was just telling her. I don't know where I'd be without her vision." "She has a way of seeing things others miss," Julian said, his voice flat. He looked directly at Elena. "She's very good at keeping things curated." Elena's smile faltered for a nanosecond. "Julian is an acoustic engineer, Caleb. He's obsessed with clarity. He hears everything." "Is that so?" Caleb looked impressed. Or perhaps he was just acting. "That must be intense, living with someone who can hear a pin drop." "It has its moments," Julian said. "Sometimes you hear things you wish you hadn't. Noise. Interference." "Well," Caleb laughed nervously, sensing a shift in the air pressure but unable to identify the source. "I hope the art speaks clearly enough tonight." "Oh, it does," Julian said softly. "Loud and clear." He watched them for the rest of the night. He watched the way their eyes met across the room when they thought no one was looking. He watched the subtle synchronicity of their movements. He was a spy in his own life, a ghost haunting his own marriage. Every time Elena touched his arm to introduce him to a donor, Julian felt a jolt of revulsion. Her touch, once the anchor of his world, now felt like a burn. But he smiled. He shook hands. He played the part of the proud husband, because he wasn't done yet. The recording in his pocket was running, but he needed more. He needed the endgame. And as he watched Caleb whisper something into Elena's ear that made her flush pink, Julian knew that the time for passive listening was over. The gallery was just the rehearsal. The real performance was coming, and he would be the one directing it. The routine had become a second skin: coffee, work, dinner, audio review. It had been 10 days since the gallery opening. 10 days of polite smiles across the breakfast table, of Julian kissing Elena's cheek and tasting the lie on her skin. He had become a master of micro-acting, matching her performance note for note. But while Elena was improvising, Julian was following a script he was writing in real time. He sat in his home office, the city lights of Chicago reduced to blurry bokeh through the rain-streaked window. The server tower under his desk hummed, a low, constant C-sharp that only he seemed to notice. He opened the folder marked Priority. This file wasn't from the car. It was from the new device he had planted in her home office, disguised as a USB charging hub. The audio quality was stark, capturing the room tone with clinical precision. Click. The sound of a chair scraping against hardwood. "I can't keep doing this, Elle." Caleb's voice was tinny, likely coming through her phone on speaker. "He looked at me the other night, like he knew." "He doesn't know anything." Elena's voice cut in, sharp and dismissive. "Julian lives in his own head. Unless you put it on a spreadsheet, he won't see it." Julian leaned back in his Aeron chair, his fingers steepled. "Is that what you think?" "I feel like a fraud," Caleb muttered. "I want us to be real. I want to wake up next to you without watching the clock." "You will," Elena soothed him, her voice dropping to that manipulative, honeyed register. "Just 2 more weeks. That's all I need." "Why 2 weeks? Why not tonight?" There was a pause on the recording, the sound of paper shuffling. "The unexpected inheritance trust from his grandmother vests on the 1st of the month," Elena said. Her voice was devoid of romance now. It was purely transactional. "And the commission on the Lakeview property closes on Friday. If I file before then, it gets complicated. If I wait, we start with a clean slate and a full bank account." Julian stopped breathing. The air in the room felt suddenly frigid. He hadn't realized the depth of the rot. He had framed this as a crime of passion, a tragic mistake born of loneliness. But this was corporate espionage applied to a marriage. She wasn't just leaving him for a starving artist. She was funding the artist's future with Julian's money. 2 weeks, Caleb repeated, sounding unconvinced but compliant. 14 days, baby, Elena promised. "Just hold on. Once the money hits the joint account, I'm gone. I'll leave the ring on the counter and we can drive to Santa Fe." "Santa Fe," Caleb mused. "I like the light there. You'll love it. No more gray skies. No more silence." Julian paused the recording. No more silence. He looked at the calendar on his desk. Today was the 2nd. The trust vested on the 14th. She planned to leave on the 15th. He felt a strange, cold clarity wash over him. The grief that had been drowning him for weeks evaporated, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was the architect. He picked up a pen and circled the 15th on his calendar in red ink. If she wanted a dramatic exit, he would give her one. But she wouldn't be driving to Santa Fe, and she certainly wouldn't be leaving the ring on the counter. He opened his editing software. He had hours of footage now. The I love yous, the complaints about his personality, the laughter, and now the financial plot. He began to drag the clips onto the timeline. He wasn't just organizing evidence for a divorce lawyer. He was composing a symphony. And the premiere was scheduled for the 14th, one day before she planned to walk out the door. Julian saved the project file. He named it simply the Playback. The studio felt less like a workspace and more like an operating theater. The air was scrubbed and cool, recirculated through silent vents. Julian sat before the mixing console, his hands moving across the faders with the muscle memory of 20 years. He wasn't mixing a symphony tonight. He was mixing a tragedy. On the screen, the timeline was a complex architecture of colored blocks. The blue waves were the ambient noise of the city. Rain, traffic, the hum of the refrigerator. The green waves were Elena's public voice, the polished bell-like tone she used for donors and dinner parties. The red waves, jagged and violent, were the secret recordings. Julian zoomed in on a clip labeled Bedroom Call 04. He applied a high-pass filter, slicing away the low-end rumble of the HVAC system until Elena's whisper sat in the center of the stereo field, naked and terrifyingly clear. "I can't stand the way he touches me anymore," her voice said through the monitors. "It feels like maintenance." Julian paused. He felt a phantom pressure on his chest, but his hand didn't shake. He reached for the EQ knob. He boosted the treble frequencies around 4 kHz, adding presence to her voice. He wanted the cruelty to sound crisp. He wanted every consonant to snap like a twig. Next, he dragged in a file from the car. Caleb's laugh. It was a warm, infectious sound. Julian compressed it, making it louder, more aggressive, ensuring it would cut through the mix. He began to arrange the clips, not chronologically, but thematically. He built a narrative arc. Act 1, the mockery of his character. Act 2, the physical betrayal. Act 3, the financial conspiracy. He layered the audio. Underneath the clip of Elena discussing the inheritance trust, he placed a subtle, ambient recording of them at their wedding. The faint, ghostly sound of them saying, "I do," buried deep in the mix. Almost subliminal, but perceptible enough to create a sickening dissonance. He worked for 6 hours straight. He didn't drink. He didn't check his phone. He was possessed by a cold, artistic fervor. This was his masterpiece. The fidelity was absolute. There was nowhere for her to hide in the dynamic range. At 4 a.m., he reached the final sequence. He found the recording from 2 days ago, the one where she had finalized the plan to leave on the 15th. 14 days, baby. Just hold on. He added a long reverb tail to the last word, letting the "on" decay into an infinite, cavernous silence. It was done. Julian exported the file. Anniversary Montage, MP4. He stood up, his joints popping. He walked to the window of the studio, looking out at the sleeping skyline of Chicago. The city looked peaceful from up here, a grid of amber and steel. But Julian knew better now. He knew that behind every lit window, there was a signal waiting to be intercepted. He went to the living room. On the mantelpiece sat the heavy cream cardstock of an invitation. Julian and Elena Vance. celebrating 10 years. October 14th, intimate dinner and cocktails. Only 6 guests were invited. Their closest circle. The people whose opinions mattered most to Elena. Her boss, her sister, the couple they vacationed with in Aspen. Julian picked up the invitation. He ran his thumb over the embossed lettering. It was perfect. A small, exclusive audience for a world premiere. He walked over to the integrated entertainment system hidden in the walnut cabinetry. He slotted a USB drive into the port. He tested the playback. The screen remained black, just as he intended, but the voice that filled the room was crystal clear. He lives in his own head, a ghost who pays the mortgage. Julian hit stop. The silence rushed back in, heavy and expectant. He was ready. The dinner party was a masterpiece of optics. The dining table was set with baccarat crystal and white orchids, reflecting the glittering skyline of downtown Chicago beyond the glass. There were 6 guests: Elena's sister, Sarah, her boss, Marcus, and the Davises, a couple they had known since college. The air smelled of truffle risotto and expensive perfume. Elena looked breathtaking in an emerald gown, her hand resting easily on Julian's shoulder as she laughed at Marcus's joke. She was radiant, secure in the knowledge that in 48 hours she would be filing for divorce with a brimming bank account. She played the part of the happy wife so well that for a second, Julian almost admired her commitment to the role. "Toast!" Sarah called out, raising her glass of Dom Perignon. "To 10 years. In this city, that's practically a lifetime." "To 10 years," the table echoed. Julian smiled. It was a tight, controlled expression. "Actually," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "I have something prepared. A little retrospective." Elena turned to him, her eyes softening with genuine surprise. "Julian, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said. "I wanted everyone to see, to hear, exactly what this marriage is." He walked to the wall-mounted console. The room dimmed automatically, a feature he had programmed weeks ago. The massive 85-inch screen descended from the ceiling, but it remained pitch black. "Is it a slideshow?" Mrs. Davis asked, tilting her head. "Listen," Julian said. He pressed play. The surround sound system, calibrated to perfection, breathed into life. There was no music, no sentimental piano track, just the raw, unmistakable sound of a car door closing. Thump. The acoustics were terrifyingly real. It sounded as if the car was in the room with them. "I can't believe he bought it." Elena's voice filled the dining room. It was crisp, magnified, stripping away any pretense of innocence. It wasn't the voice she used for toasts. It was her private voice, mocking and cold. The guests shifted in their seats. Sarah lowered her glass. Elena froze, her fork hovering halfway to her mouth. "He's so desperate to keep me happy," the recording continued. "He bought me those earrings just because I frowned at breakfast." A man's laugh, Caleb's laugh, graveled through the subwoofers. "Poor guy. He thinks he's investing in a future." "He's investing in my exit strategy," Elena's voice replied. "Once the trust fund clears on the 14th, I'm gone. I'll leave the ring on the counter." The color drained from Elena's face so fast it looked like a physical injury. She stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "Julian, turn it off," she whispered. Her voice was trembling, a stark contrast to the confident predator on the speakers. Julian didn't move. He leaned against the wall, watching her. The audio shifted. A new clip. The bedroom tone. "I love you," Elena said on the tape. "I love you more than I ever loved him." The silence in the room was absolute, heavy enough to crush lungs. Marcus looked at his plate. Sarah looked at her sister with a mixture of confusion and horror. "Julian, please!" Elena screamed, lunging toward the console. But the track wasn't finished. The financial details came next. The plan to hide assets. The specific mockery of her boss, Marcus, who was sitting right there. "Marcus is an idiot," the tape played. "He thinks I'm working late. He doesn't know I'm with you." Marcus stiffened, his face hardening into stone. Elena reached the console and frantically hit buttons, but Julian had locked the interface. The audio continued, relentless, a sonic autopsy of her character. She spun around to face the room, her back to the black screen. She looked at her sister, then at Marcus, and finally at Julian. She looked small. The emerald dress suddenly looked like a costume she didn't know how to wear. It's edited," she stammered, tears spilling over. "He changed it. He's crazy." "It is edited," Julian said calmly, speaking over her digital ghost. "I removed the background noise. I wanted the truth to be the only thing left in the room." The recording ended with the long, reverb-heavy decay of her promise. "Just hold on." The silence that followed was louder than the recording. It rang in their ears. Elena looked at Julian. Her face was pale, a mask of total shock. She realized then that he hadn't just caught her. He had been watching her, listening to her, dissecting her for weeks. "Happy anniversary, Elena," Julian said softly. He picked up his wine glass and took a sip. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. The exodus was swift. There were no polite goodbyes, no promises to catch up soon. The guests fled the penthouse as if the air itself had become toxic. Marcus didn't look at Elena as he put on his coat. Sarah whispered something to her sister, a sharp, hissed sentence that sounded more like an accusation than comfort, before walking out the door. Then, there were two. The apartment was terrifyingly quiet. The audio system had long since been muted, but the ghost of the recording still hung in the room, vibrating against the glass walls. Elena didn't scream. She didn't throw the baccarat crystal or claw at his face. The brutality of the exposure had drained the fight out of her. She stood by the window, her reflection ghosted against the city lights, looking like a transparent version of herself. "How long?" she asked. Her voice was brittle, devoid of the resonance it used to hold. 3 weeks, Julian answered. He was still sitting at the head of the table, his wine glass half full. He felt a strange, numbing buzz, like the static after a broadcast ends. 3 weeks, she repeated. She turned to look at him. Her mascara was smeared, a dark bruise under her eyes. "And you just watched. You let me sleep in that bed. You let me make plans." "I was just listening," Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You were the one making the noise." She stared at him for a long moment, searching for the man she had married 10 years ago. But that man was gone, overwritten by the surveillance. "You're a monster, Julian," she whispered. "You think you're the victim because I cheated? You violated every second of my life. You stole my privacy. You stole my thoughts." "I stole your secrets," he corrected. "There's a difference." She didn't argue. She walked past him, the silk of her dress brushing the back of his chair with a soft swish. It was the last time he would feel her proximity. He heard her go into the bedroom. He heard the distinct zip of a suitcase. He heard drawers opening and closing. He sat there, drinking his wine, cataloging the sounds of his marriage being packed away. 20 minutes later, the front door clicked open. "I'll send someone for the rest," she said from the hallway. She didn't say goodbye. Thud. The door closed. The lock engaged automatically. Julian was alone. He stood up and walked to the center of the living room. The view was spectacular. Chicago burning with electricity and life. But inside, the silence was absolute. This was what he had designed the apartment for. Acoustic perfection, isolation. No street noise, no neighbor noise. And now, no Elena noise. He walked over to the console. He saw the USB drive still blinking in the port. The playback. He pulled it out and held it in his palm. It weighed nothing, yet it contained the destruction of a decade. He walked into the kitchen and dropped the drive into the garbage disposal. He flipped the switch. A harsh, grinding mechanical shriek filled the room as the plastic and metal were chewed into dust. Then, silence again. Julian poured himself another drink. He sat on the sofa where he had first planted the bug in her purse. He closed his eyes and tried to listen. He strained his ears, waiting for a sound. A breath, a footstep, a lie, but there was nothing. Just the high-pitched ringing of his own tinnitus, a permanent frequency of isolation. He had wanted the truth. He had demanded high fidelity. Now he had it. The signal was clean. The noise floor was zero. And it was the loudest thing he had ever heard.